So, in our second session, we've got three very eminent ladies who are going to tell us lots about scenic art. I've asked them to do their own biographies because you've heard quite enough from me. All I will say is, before we start, we just thought you might like to see the auditorium.
Oh.
So, 2-minute potted history is the cartouches on the dress circle and the upper circle were added in 1901 for modernisation purposes when the new Theatre Royal interior by one Mr. Frank Matcham was being added. So we were in modernisation mode. At the same time, the carrier tint on the boxes, the Corinthian columns and the lower stalls box columns were also modernised at the time. But essentially the structure is largely 1867, including the extraordinary ceiling of the auditorium because of its wonderful acoustic properties. In the centre, the projection box, not the Matcham box of 1919, but a much later one, possibly put in the 20s when talkies came to Newcastle, and really rather a hideous thing that inserts itself now in the way into separating the upper circle. So one of our proposals is that that will actually be removed, and we'll go back to a pre-cinema configuration in the upper circle, as well as likely that I'm sort of hopeful that our next project, once we've done phase one of the Grand Saloon, is going to be a really lovely gallery reseating project, which would be really wonderful, and it would also help us commercially. So that's where we are. Anyway, enough of the grand old lady. You've seen her. Let's drop the house tabs back in, and I'll hand over to Wendy, who's going to give us those papers. Wendy, thank you very much. Guess who's got to take that back to Northampton?
Would you like me to use a mic? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So, my name is Wendy Waszut-Barrett. I'm the founder of Historic Stage Services, a US-based company in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the States. And I come to you today as a theater historian, preservation specialist in terms of scenery, a scenic designer, and most importantly, a scenic artist. My presentation will look in detail at the paint medium used for 19th century scenic artists, by 19th century scenic artists and its capabilities. Then I will explain how my passion about the history of scenic art came into being and how both past and present influence my understanding of theater history. Each aspect of my career creates a lens through which I view theater history. For me, the phrase, preserving the past, goes far beyond the conservation and replication of historic artifacts. It also applies to preserving the theatrical trades. Although many scene painting techniques have been well documented in various publications and memoirs, much has been lost from contemporary application and practice. More specifically, the institutional memories in scenic studios. I'm going to shed some light on 19th century scene painting practices because understanding the nuances of distemper painting.
Sorry, Wendy, sorry to interrupt, Wendy. Would you mind using the mic? It's
No,
getting a bit
it's
hard. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And I will start at the beginning. You want me to go to slide 2? I will go to slide 2. Also, this will be 24 minutes and 50 seconds. Okay. So, although Many scene painting techniques remain well documented in various publications and memoirs. Much has been lost from contemporary application. More specifically, the institutional memory in Scenic studios. I'm going to shed some light on scene painting practices and the distemper paint system that helps us understand the metamorphic nature of stage settings created by 19th century and early 20th century scenic artists. Distemper paint solely consists of two ingredients: color, dry pigment in paste form, and a binder, diluted hide glue. It is really an amazing artistic medium. In dry form, both pigment and glue can be stored for decades, if not over a century, weathering a wide range of temperatures. There is also no waste during the scene painting process, as dried piles of pigment can quickly be reconstituted with water. In 1903, American scenic artist Grace Wishar explained, "Distemper paint is really a beautiful medium. You can produce such fine effects with it, but it's very tricky to use unless you just know how to do it." Over a decade later, her colleague, Frank Atkinson, in 1916, wrote the following statement about distemper paint. "Distemper colors change greatly in value as they dry out. The student must not let a few failures discourage him. True color deductions will come with experience." And almost a decade later, in 1924, Joseph Parker described distemper paint in his publication, Studio and Stage, as a peculiarly difficult medium to handle. He explained, "In some instances, the color, when applied, dries several degrees lighter in tone than it was originally, while in others remains unaltered. Considerable skill, if I may put it so baldly, is therefore needed in the direct painting with this medium, and no fixed rules can be laid down for overcoming the characteristics I have mentioned. Long and painstaking experience is alone capable of solving each fresh color problem as it arises. For over 35 years, I have been challenged with each distemper painting project. That being said, there is no other paint medium that I would rather use for stage settings. Every time I pick up a paintbrush and paint a backdrop, I become part of a scenic art timeline, continuing the legacy of those who came before me. Nothing feels quite so pure to handle, nor reflects stage lights quite so well. So let's look at how the paint was prepared. Pigment arrived at a studio typically in three forms: dry powder, compressed block, or wet pulp. Blocks of dry color necessitated grinding prior to transformation into paste. Pigment paste was placed on a scenic artist palette and mixed with diluted hide glue, also called size water, or working size, or just size, hence the term size painting. Both color and binder necessitated careful preparation, the tasks completed by skilled individuals. In larger studios, color men supervised preparation and distribution of colors, as ill-prepared pigment, meaning granules that were not fully dissolved, could compromise an entire painting. Making size from hide glue was also a skilled task, each batch affected by heat and humidity. Water is added to dried hide glue granules or a slab and slowly cooked to a honey-like consistency, then diluted in water. Here is an example of a scenic artist's palette filled with bowls of pigment paste and a size warmer below. The preparation of pigment paste, the cooking of size, and the setting up of a palette takes time. However, the actual distemper painting process makes up for any lost time in the beginning. As I presented last year, there were two prominent traditions at play in 19th century scenic art when I looked at immigrant contributions to North American theater. Each was defined by the viscosity, the thickness or the body of paint, and its application. There was the use of transparent glazes, depicted on your left, and opaque washes, depicted on the right. Distemper paint was applied to the scenery in two ways: up on a vertical frame, or down on the floor. Both versions were transported over the world especially to the United States, and it was referred to as the English method for painting up and the continental method for painting down. So where do I fall within the history of scenic art? I am a hybrid. I was trained in the Midwestern United States using distemper paint in the form of opaque washes on a motorized paint frame at the university, but I worked as a freelance scenic artist using premixed paints and the continental method on the floor where that was preferred. This is the motorized paint frame that I use in the States. It's at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. There are at least 5 motorized paint frames in colleges and universities in my state, and several more at regional theaters. In fact, the past 8 shows that I've designed have featured distemper paint while working with the lighting designer. And distemper paints and vertical paint frames pair together because dripping isn't an issue, as with each drip it is reabsorbed into the actual fabric. From a paint process, a movable paint frame allows artists to quickly and accurately lay vertical lines without lining sticks or a straight edge, which means that the painting of drapery folds is extremely effective, as you can play with the viscosity of paint for translucent effects. Here's a view from the back of the drapes, and you can see how thinly it's painted. So, when backlit with just a simple white light, muslin painted with distemper paint can take on the appearance of glowing silk. Here are the 3 of 8 distemper palettes that I use while painting scenery, all ranging in size for the scale of the project. I have tweaked traditional methods over the years, incorporating large baking pans as they are easier to use. But regardless of what type of paint a scenic artist uses, it's more than painting a picture. It's a way of seeing and applying color. That being said, distemper paint is the easiest way to teach color theory and painted illusion for the stage. The success of painted illusion for the stage is understanding the nuance of each color, strategic color combinations, and an economy of brushstroke. So I want to get us all on the same page, recognizing we're not all scenic artists. Mm-hmm. Each primary and secondary color has a characteristic. So the primaries being red, yellow, blue, the secondaries being orange, purple, and green. The easiest way to describe this is cool versus warm yellow. And I don't want to get caught up with any specific color names, as each is usually dependent upon the supplier. So on the left is a warm yellow, and on the right is a cool yellow. Also of importance in painted illusion is the contrast of value. There must be a great contrast to be able to be seen from a distance. Scenic artists paint for a distance, just like the fresco artists who are painting cathedral ceilings. There must be a division. It cannot be photographically replicated or painted too carefully, or it becomes fuzzy from a distance. That is why scenic artists have to contrast both value and hue. The audience's eye needs to work, so the scene will appear more dimensional and realistic from afar. When you examine the painting up close, it falls apart into dashes and dabs, showing the economy of brushstroke. There is a rule of 3 in much historic scenery, and this is for value selection, sticking to a light, medium, and dark to work up any object. This contrast works for foliage, architecture, drapery, making painted details remain visible from a distance. In addition to the light, medium, and dark values, there's also an alternation between cool and warm color characteristics. So for example, for dark, medium, and light, it would be cool, warm, cool, or warm, cool, warm. Helps reflect lights better. Even when applying the same value, compositions such as foliage will place warm and cool next to one another, helping give definition to the shape. It's this strategic color placement that reflects stage light and accentuates the painted detail, providing dimensionality. Here is an example on your left of overblending from 1914. It's painting that shows a lack of contrast in both value and color. It will make it look blurred from a distance. On the right shows the contrast of value and color, draperies that appear more dimensional from a distance. And if we take color out of the composition, we can still see the difference and need for a contrast of value. Scenic artists understood the characteristics of each lighting system, adjusting their color and their value accordingly. So here's an example of scenery produced for electric light, a popular combination in North America and the rest of the world at the time between about 1890s and 1920s. And this all goes back to color selection and application of distemper paint. It's the use of warm and cool consistently to create color combination that will reflect stage lights. Strategic color combinations also help support day to night transitions. So if you have a blue sky or a blue shadow, it is never just a blue. It is a blue that has a warmth added to it because that will reflect the other lights that are being produced on the stage. And it was through the conservation of historic scenery that I began to realize the viscosity of paint and how so many were able to work as a translucency. Here's an example from 1902 of both the front and the back of the drop, so you can see how little color was actually applied to the drop. And this practice continued up until the 1920s, unless the scenery was painted over and over again, such as wings in theaters. So from 1923, you can also tell how thinly it was painted. Here's another example as we look at, oh, I just lost my place. My apologies. Here's an example of a distemper painting that I created for La Main Anonyme by the Chevalier de Saint-Georges for Haymarket Opera Company in Chicago. And through doing a series of shows for them, I realized that the key to distemper painting is actually how little pigment is applied to the drop. And how the body of the paint reacts. So very thin paint or low viscosity will appear opaque from the front, but will remain especially flexible for shipping. And that is how I was able to pack the 8 ground rows that ranged from 30 inches up to 60 inches that were 28 feet long into a small suitcase to carry on the plane within weight limits. And in many cases, we have forgotten how much we can do with just an ordinary white light source placed behind a distemper drop. And this has to do with the viscosity and the layering of colors. The image on the left shows a section of a distemper drop just under work lights. The image on the right is the exact same painting, but with a standard white lamp placed behind the painting. Underlying colors are revealed, transitioning the entire palette without the necessity of colored lights, no gels, no glass. And again, this is the metamorphic nature of distemper paint that supported 19th century painted illusion for the stage. Here's another detail, but again with something we're more familiar with, a jugged light. And it's more what we're used to. But when we combine the opportunity to project colored front light on the drop and to partially illuminate it to pick up the distempered colors, the possibilities are almost endless. And this is what we're more comfortable with as far as a standard translucency, not using dye, but just thinned distemper paint from 1912. Many audiences have never experienced the magical allure and metamorphic nature of distemper settings for the stage. This beauty, however, can be instantaneously destroyed with poor lighting. When lit poorly, painted legacies from the past resemble dull-colored, threadbare rags at best. Side light will especially accentuate wrinkles. So here, because seeing is believing, and this is just work lights. The idea of going from side work lights to front work lights, and it can instantaneously erase. Oh, we'll go again. And then a close-up, and I'm going to do it one more time, since you know what you're looking at now. Now, this is nothing fancy, just a shift in direction. So why am I so passionate about the history of scenic art, as many people ask? It started in college, as I took one scene painting class after another, same distemper painting class, different level. I repeatedly queried my professors about 19th century women scenic artists. And his response was, they were all boys, get over it. This was not a subjective statement or one intending to put me in my place. He was simply teaching what he had been taught. And his statement, however, really lit a flame inside of me. And I decided I was going to learn everything I could about the history of scenic art, distemper painting, the people, and the process. Part of this quest involved extracurricular studies and museum exhibits. In 1989, I received an undergraduate research opportunities program grant to process a scenic collection from the Great Western Stage Equipment Company established in the 1920s. I received a second grant, processed another collection that included Sossman and Landis and the New York Studios collection. And the acquisition of these collections was spearheaded by my mentor and university professor, now Professor Emeritus Lance Brockman. His acquisition of these collections was contingent upon their open access to students and for the use of students. Copy work was critical to his scenic art program. This meant that university students could request a design, a historic design, set up their watercolor palette in the reading room, and replicate the composition. I went a step further, took all of these details, enlarged them into distemper paint on 5x5 flats using traditional materials and explored techniques. And his hope was that we would digitize the collection so that students, academic colleagues, professionals worldwide would have free access to all of these materials. And that happened from 1999 to 2000. I worked with these two collections and a previous one, known as the Twin Cities Scenic Company collection, to create an online digital database where I was in charge of the layout, contents, text, and assigning metadata to over 3,000 artifacts, of which I still return to the collections to explore details of many of the designs. But it was the assigning metadata, replicating designs, repairing stage scenery, that have all helped me make a series of connections while working on site and doing research. And it was my continued work with these collections for over 35 years that has allowed me to immediately access original designs. For example, this curtain in January was at the Theater Museum of Repertoire Americana in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. And one of the curtains they had stashed behind, I was able to connect it with the original design because I had assigned the metadata, 24 years ago. Also was the case when I preserved the 74 scenic drops with 18 volunteers in Santa Fe, New Mexico between 2002 and 2005. At the time, I was also working on a sister collection, again, the designs in the Hollick collection, so that I was able to explore two installations delivered at the same time, 1911 to 1912, by the same scenic studio, and to look at the techniques by the same installation crew. And this ended up from the first series of designs from 1990 to looking at the preservation of the scenery into a book in 2018 that allowed us to pair all of the original costumes, lighting systems, scenery, and props so that we could explore the nuances of the scenery on the stage. And so for me, the past, my past, the history, has continued to inform my present. And I still have that fire to learn all I can while I can. This is one of the reasons I am so adamant to share every bit of my research, regardless of the consequences. Because this helps spark others and helps draw information to me. It's always been available online. And whether it's theater owners, backstage crews, or the descendants of scenic artists, many historic theaters start to realize that they are part of a much larger process and network that goes across country lines. And I am going to conclude with a topic that I started with last year. It was Harley Mary, also known as Ebenezer Britton. He worked as a performer and scenic artist in the United Kingdom, emigrating to the United States in the 1860s. After moving to America, Mary was integral in organizing several groups, including the Protective Alliance of Scene Painters in America. This organization became the current union in North America, known as the United Scenic Artists. Recently, the union produced a video about their history, listing these men still as the foremost scenic artists and designers in America, of which Mary was listed. And there is no doubt that this group was skilled, but it did not compromise the best that America had at the time. They only represent a small number of scenic artists working in a few specific regions, but the picture is very telling, especially when you realize the nationally renowned scenic artists who were not included in the picture. For me, these men represent those who had the most to lose without establishing a protective alliance and keeping other scenic artists out. Artists like Mabel Buell. It was not until 1918 that women were allowed to join the union in North America. This is 2 years before women had the right to vote. Mabel Buell's late entry makes it appear that women were just beginning to enter the scenic art field, few and far between, perpetuating the misconceptions that scenic artists were primarily white men. It's important to understand that when Mabel joined the union, she was not only a scenic artist, but a studio owner. Both she and her mother worked as scenic artists, as did her father and brother. In many cases, it was a family affair. By the way, this is Mabel directing her employees at Tyne, her staff numbered 20. When Mabel joined the union in 1918, she was described as the only girl in the profession. Buell continued to be listed as such throughout the 1920s, but by this time, generations of women had worked as scenic artists. Some were wives, some were daughters, some were sisters, and some entered the profession all on their own. Here are 3 examples of women scenic artists identified as the only over the course of 2 decades. On the left is Grace Wishart, listed as the only woman scenic artist in 1901. She had been working for over a decade at this point. On the right is Irene Pendrith, listed as the first and only scenic artist in 1909. And in the center is Mabel Buell, pictured in 1921, and still listed as the only woman scenic artist in America. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case. Here are a few names of women scenic artists from the mid-19th to early 20th century. Although there are many, many more, but these are the women who painted stage scenery and were listed as such in census reports, city directories, and newspaper accounts. Not, as we all know, not all scenic artists were listed as such. I believe historians tried to do their best to represent the world as it was. However, at some point, the contributions of generations of artists were left out of theater history. Aesthetic shifts, new design movements, and innovative technology continue to be credited to a very select few. But the use of only to describe a female scenic artist in newspapers sends a very underlying message. They are not a threat. After all, there is only one. And the same language was used to describe scenic artists who were people of color. Over the past few years, I have identified women, indigenous people, people of color, who worked as 19th century scenic artists in the 19th century. And many of these discoveries were while I was writing 120 biographies of Sossman and Landis scenic art employees for my book, upcoming book, Sossman and Landis, Shaping the Landscape of American Theater. Today, online databases provide massive amounts of information about individuals who worked as scenic artists. We're now able to identify thousands of individuals whose contributions to theater history were either forgotten or ignored. This means that we are responsible for reframing the history of scenic art and theater history. Women and people of color are often not counted, but they were present. They contributed to our shared theater industry. We can no longer solely teach theater from the same books that have been used by generations of theater students. We are completely in control when choosing the lens through which we depict our industry's past, present, and future.